Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week in Module 9, we're going to take a look at a German idealist philosopher named Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel is a very important character in our particular trajectory of philosophy that we have set up in this course, because Hegel is able to look both backwards and forwards into the future, and that puts him in a really remarkable position. He is on the cusp of modernity, which is an idea we've already started to discuss in this course. And Hegel is able to look backwards, much like Smith and Ferguson had done, to look back to Aristotelian virtues, to morality, to the ancient city-states or the ancient polis of Greece. And from that, devise some of the things that we need to move forward with into this new world, this new modern world. So, as I typically do with the other courses, I've broken everything down. The first part will be, of course, an introduction to Hegel. And then after that, we're going to look at how Hegel places his ideas. And as much as Hegel is an idealist, which means that he filters his view of reality through ideas. We're going to look at modern society, which is, of course, modern capitalist society, industrial society, and what happens to freedom in this kind of a society, and with a special interest on alienation, because this is something that deeply concerned Hegel. This was something he wished to reconcile so that individuals would feel, as he used to say, at home in the world. So if you don't feel at home in the world, you're going to feel some degree of alienation where you feel disconnected from your surroundings, your family, your community, where you work, whatever institutions are mediating you as you traveled from being a child to a young person to an adult, dealing with other adults. So all of these things are really a part of Hegel's very comprehensive view of individuals and society, but always from that philosophical point of view. And then we'll finish up with Hegel today and ask the question, is there something that's living and something that's dead in Hegel's thought? What can we salvage and what can we maybe set aside? So to begin with, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel lived 1770 to 1831. So he's 61 when he passed away. Died of cholera, not that that's important, but there was a cholera epidemic in Germany in 1831 and he unfortunately succumbed to it. But by this point, he was already a very recognized philosopher, both in Germany and around the world. And he was known as an idealist philosopher. And what makes Hegel so remarkable is his thoughts were so pervasive and also divisive in continental philosophy that anyone that practices philosophy today, even by way of rejecting Hegel, you have to tangle with him. You've got to deal with him because he is literally an obstruction in the road. And you either try to bang your way through it or get around it, or at least ask for him to move out of the way by acknowledging his presence. Regardless, Hegel is this commanding presence in the history of philosophy, and in particular in the trajectory that we have set up. And I've done this, of course, on purpose, so that we can see how these individuals work both with and against one another. But Hegel was a divisive character. Regardless, even his opponents recognized how influential and pervasive his ideas were. Now, what makes Hegel notoriously either difficult or straightforward, depending on how you approach it, is this very comprehensive philosophy of spirit, or philosophy of Geist, which is the German word for spirit. And what Hegel wanted to do was, as a great synthesizer, was to basically bring together, integrate psychology, the political state, economics, history, art, religion, and ultimately philosophy, and basically see whether or not it was interconnected. And he said absolutely it was, because all of these things were manifestations of Geist, manifestations of the spirit. So the human spirit, our desire to always become better, that drive that we have to better ourselves, perfect our world, perfect our interactions with one another. Anything that develops us as better human beings, and in turn society, is all part of that manifestation of spirit that Hegel believed informed all of these different disciplines. So he was comprehensive and a synthesizer in that sense, that is kind of all-encompassing theory, this philosophy of spirit, within it were all these different individual disciplines that all kind of moved in concert with one another. He was absolutely a learned philosopher. He had an almost terrifying and immense knowledge of so many different disciplines. He wrote on art, literature, religion, science, philosophy, political life, economics. And this is, again, something that makes Hegel a uniquely different kind of philosopher. We see the beginnings of it in Ferguson and Smith. We see the beginnings of it also in kind of Enlightenment thinking. And we haven't really dealt a whole lot with the French Enlightenment. More so, we've looked at the Scottish Enlightenment. And this notion of common sense, this notion of optimism, this notion of that people know how to do the best thing in order to move forward. All of these things Hegel was aware of, but still had this immense knowledge that allowed him to integrate all these different disciplines under one umbrella that he called Geist, or spirit. Now, what is really surprising is, as much as Hegel worked on defining the individual, he himself was very reluctant to include himself in his thinking. For Hegel, it didn't matter who you were, where you lived, what era. You were simply there to report and interpret the world, and often interpret the world kind of after the fact. And this is something about Hegel that is almost a paradox, deeply involved with the individual, right, the subject in society, yet refused to allow the particularities of his own life to intrude or influence or prejudice his philosophy in any way. So he believed that the philosopher, even after he had mastered their craft, acquired the knowledge needed for its exercise, and he spent a lifetime doing this, should not strictly contribute of their own. In other words, whether it was Hegel or someone else who did the writing should stand on its own. Just because Hegel happened to live in Germany before it was actually Germany, but in one of the many duchies that he lived in, because he lived in several different cities, it didn't matter. What Hegel wanted us to do was to just simply observe. Don't interfere, don't influence, just observe. And that really makes him a remarkable individual. So, subject matter, didn't matter what it was, whether it was philosophy of nature, political institutions, or even Geist itself, even spirit itself. If you place some of yourself into the work, there could be some problems, there could be some errors. And so by removing the observer and simply presenting what is observed, that would be good philosophizing. So only those idiosyncratic opinions of the philosopher are the things that may lead to error. Perhaps a blind spot, a bias, a prejudice of some sort, a predisposition. All of these different things will influence the philosopher unconsciously. The philosopher needs to know that that may occur, and as much as possible to simply objectively observe. Now, how well he did this, that's an open question, because Hegel, at least as much as possible, tried to do this. Now, when he criticized others, right, other philosophers, and this is him looking backwards, again, it was this remarkable ability to look at what they had written and not shoot it down or dismiss it, but to simply say, look, let's examine what was happening at the time and see whether this idea was perhaps the best that could be stated at that particular time. So he said, look, if you criticize the view of others and you compare your views with theirs, what you are trying to do is to show the opponent's view developed into your own. So what he's really saying is the ancient Greeks, Descartes, Bacon, Smith, and Ferguson, everyone who came before him did the best they could. And so rather than shoot down their ideas, just like Geist integrates everything together, Hegel integrated all these different thoughts together. So what he tried to do was be kind. He was kind towards previous philosophers. If he offered a criticism, it would be a kind of constructive criticism to allow the reader to understand why, for example, the ancient Athenians had this almost distorted knowledge of, or at least understanding of freedom. It was freedom in the abstract, in the sense that they were writing while they were living in a slave state. So you cannot talk about freedom in a substantial way when you live in a slave state. So Hegel points this out. He doesn't dismiss their ideas about freedom, but he qualifies them. He contextualizes them so that the reader understands how Hegel is viewing these previous ideas in this very clear and well-articulated context. The historical context is everything, because Hegel was someone who believed in the movement of history and movement within history. And in fact, Hegel is one of the very first to realize that knowledge and the intellect has a history. So obviously we can't hit the ground running the first time around and get everything right. We're going to make lots of mistakes. Our ability to reason, our intellect, our history of consciousness will kind of zigzag back and forth, maybe sometimes go backwards, but generally speaking, kind of going forwards. Hegel saw this and said that the movement of thought in history is paramount to understanding where we are now. So if we are looking at it in the same way that Geist incorporates all these other disciplines within it, Hegel was doing the same thing. So that is about as far as he could get in terms of identifying who he was as a writer and a philosopher. Again, it didn't matter that it was him. It could have been anyone else. And there are, of course, many other German philosophers, Schelling and Schlegel and so on, and Fichte, who wrote before him. But we're looking at Hegel right now. But he is someone that viewed the world in this very comprehensive kind of way. And that way, we're able to see how history develops along a number of different paths, sometimes conflicting paths, where, for example, the social conditions don't match up with the intellectual development. But that intellectual development then is applicable to society to move it forward. So that interaction between these different disciplines still always advances things forward. So Hegel writes in the introduction to the preface of the Elements of Philosophy of Law, he says, okay, first of all, that no one can leap beyond their own age. So you can only know the age that you're in. So he writes, to comprehend what is the task of philosophy. For what is reason. Reason exists, and that is the task of the philosopher, to not only comprehend reason, but how it exists in the world. So he goes on, as far as the individual is concerned, each individual is in any case a child of his time. Thus philosophy too is its own time comprehended in thoughts. It is just as foolish to imagine that any philosopher can transcend its contemporary world as that an individual can overleap his own time or leap over roads. This is a reference to roads from the ancient world, which was a river, of course, very wide. You can't leap over it. The point he's making here is that each individual is a product of their own historical time, and we can only know that time. And we can at least hope to understand the previous generations and previous historical eras. But here is Hegel, again, telling us on the one hand, not to include ourselves in our philosophizing, yet deeply concerned with the fact that we are historical beings. This is something else that makes Hegel such a remarkable character. I tangled with Hegel for 5 years, writing my PhD dissertation, and it took me that long to grasp his ideas fully. But it's been very rewarding, even by way of criticism. So this is something that really has lasted a long time, that we are children of our own time. We can only know our own time well. And anything prior to that, we can at least seek to understand. But to start predicting the future, that's hubris, right? That's pride. So we need to be very careful. But what we are trying to understand in the world is reason, the existence of reason in the world. Okay, so that's a tall order. So he was very ambitious. He wanted to master the totality of human knowledge. And there was lots of it at this point, because science now has been really in earnest, moving forward since about the 1600s. So he's writing about 200 years later, give or take. And so the totality of human knowledge at this point is very comprehensive. And so what he knew in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, is all of the political, cultural, artistic, and intellectual situations that he found himself amongst and within. And this was literally what he wanted to study. He wanted to make sure that all those disciplines, those forms of human knowledge, what was it that sort of, comparatively speaking, what brought them together? Why did they coexist in this way at this time? How could reason be expressed in political structures, cultural expressions, intellectual endeavors? What does reason look like in these different disciplines? So this is what he wanted to do. He was what's called an encyclopedist. And this is a form of thinking that is generated from the radical French Enlightenment, who were basically encyclopedists. They literally wrote the first encyclopedias. Denis Diderot, writing over almost a 35-year period, created the first encyclopedia. So Hegel found that not only remarkable, because that had been almost within his lifetime when Diderot finally finished, but he liked the idea of synthesizing information. Now, I mentioned last week that while Hegel is living, because remember, born in 1770, so at a very young age, he is not experiencing firsthand, but very well aware of the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. And so here's an individual keeping his eyes wide open and observing as objectively as he can this age of political and social and cultural upheaval. There was so much going on. And of course, the Revolutionary Wars that followed the French Revolution throughout the early 1800s. There is we don't know how believable it is, but it certainly is a great looking image of Hegel basically racing out the back door with a copy of Philosophy of Spirit, handwritten, he had just finished, running out the back door as Napoleon is showing up at the front door, as he was simply trying to conquer Germany. So at that time, Napoleon, considered by many in Germany to be a world leader, quickly soured, right? His view quickly soured in Germany. Beethoven had written the Ninth Symphony in honor of Napoleon, and there is the original paper, the sheet music, where he madly scratched out Napoleon's name to the point of tearing the paper itself. Hegel was the same way. So he was certainly able to change his mind, but at that time, Napoleon was considered to be this a world leader on horseback. And of course, things change, and Hegel's attitude changes as well. Now, along with these different revolutions, some of which we talked about last week, there are also other things that are going on that now begin to tie philosophy to other fields. So this same era, right, the era just immediately prior to Hegel, and during his lifetime, there was first of all Immanuel Kant's Critique of Reason. His book, Critique of Pure Reason, is basically a warning shot for individuals to be very careful as idealists to try to work out sort of theoretical problems only on a theoretical basis, because we have the capacity to kind of create those bridges, right, from the physical to the metaphysical world. Kant is warning us, okay, be very careful. Right? Be very careful using that dialectical kind of thinking, truth by consensus, because we have the capacity to make mistakes, and we need to be mindful of that. So there's Kant. There's also philosophical trends that now start to spread out. The philosophy begins to move and spread its tentacles into literary and cultural developments. Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. This is a form of kind of romantic writing, where the turmoil of internal feelings and the relationships of individuals to society and especially to modernity, all this storm and stress is basically all the internal conflicts that people feel as they try to move from this previous generation into the world of modernity, many of them not successfully. Now, that was something that was really not in ancient Greek thought, because there was no Sturm or Drang. There was no storm and stress. Everything was pretty calm because there was a much more basic understanding of the relationship between the individual and the state. So as things become more complicated in the world of modernity, so do the ideas to try to explain it. So the reassessment of earlier philosophers and earlier philosophical systems, this is what Hegel famously was doing, reassessment of the validity of Plato and Aristotle. And remember, it was Descartes, right, who was the one that said, I think, therefore I am. Therefore I can formulate my own opinions. I don't need to rely on authority figures. Hegel was doing the same thing. He was reassessing, and again, much more conciliatory, much kinder towards these previous thinkers, and trying to get the best of their work. Again, if he provided any kind of criticism, it was constructive criticism. It was an attempt to understand the social and political or cultural conditions that produced that kind of knowledge at the time. And certainly the most important one is the notion of freedom, right? Freedom for Hegel, freedom is everything. We need to be happy, but we need to be free. Because remember, the ancient Greeks, if you're an aristocrat and you don't have to work a day in your life because you're lucky enough to have been born into money and you have slaves to take care of you, you're not going to worry about freedom. You're already free. What else do you want? I want to be happy. Well, Hegel, by the early 1800s, said, yeah, that's all fine and good. But to be happy is to be free. And that's why he had such an abiding interest in the idea, the philosophy, the concepts associated with freedom. And finally, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the French encyclopedists of the mid-18th century, who were also very critical of royal authority and religion. Hegel was a Lutheran, and so he understood the notion of protest, but protest only in order to make something better. So he never doubted his faith. In fact, wrote about it extensively, and really came to the conclusion that philosophy and religion really deal with the same content. They just look different. They appear in different forms, but the same notion of reason occurs and appears in both of them. So the content of religion and philosophy are the same, so no conflict there. They take a different form. Now, Hegel, in terms of his immediate successors, successors, but previous thinkers, my mistake. Hegel was very excited by Kant, also excited by the French Revolution, but at a very young age, because at this point now he'd be 19, so he's a teenager on the cusp of adulthood, and by this point in time, he's realizing that, okay, the revolution is terror and bloodlust and just a lot of carnage. And he really began to doubt if that revolutionary lust could actually lead to something good. And so in Phenomenology of Spirit, writing in 1807, he talks about absolute freedom and terror, right? Absolute terror is something that would be quite terrifying. And essentially he says, at one point, the revolution's got to be over, right? Things need to settle down for us to be able to build something for the future. So although he was really excited by the French Revolution, perhaps more so the ideas associated with it than the revolution itself, that opinion changed pretty quickly during the very short time that the revolution was on, because there was a tremendous amount of carnage. As a matter of fact, because of that, Hegel talked about the slaughter bench of history, which is, again, a very provocative image, but history as a slaughter bench. And really, that's all he knew. He had inherited years and years of religious wars across Western Europe. He knew about the American Revolution. He knew about the French Revolution as well, and just really realized how often history was a bloodbath. So his view of history was literally a slaughter bench. But despite that, he said, revolution, as awful as it may be, is still a necessary phase in the growth of the modern state. When things are so disconnected that the powers that be, whatever the institutions that are in power, when they are so utterly disconnected from the people, the degree of alienation and unfreedom is so great that only a revolution can fix it. So this is kind of the way he was thinking. And of course, much like the French revolutionary theorists, like Saint-Just and Robespierre and the rest of them, they too, right, along with Hegel, were looking at Greek society, Greek culture, and philosophy. If you remember back to our first week together, I talked about the second week, talking about who were the Greeks and the influence that they had. Hegel was also part of that. He was also part of that enthusiastic sort of reestablishment and reassessment of Greek culture. And as time went on, and he kept revisiting his ideas, he ended up getting a more sober and perhaps a more even-tempered view of Greek ethical life. And one of the main things that he says is that how dare we talk about freedom in a slave state? It just should not be done. Okay, so that's kind of Hegel in a nutshell. And here at this point, I just want to start with the first part on modern society. And Hegel did really feel enamored by the work of Smith and Ferguson, especially Ferguson, because Ferguson's work is something that we see starting as early as 1804 and 5, early sort of forms of what he called the first philosophy of life, first philosophy of society. Hegel is working, trying to sort of orient himself around this notion of modernity, and especially the concept of civil society. Hegel revisits this idea a number of times, and if you read through all of his work, as I did, when you see it first appearing in 1802, 3, 4, it's there, but not fully formed, right? It's taking from Ferguson. It quotes, in fact, even from Ferguson. But by the time Hegel is finished with it in 1821, which is a decade before he passes away, he has presented a much more comprehensive view of civil society being this sort of major cornerstone of ethical life, or in German, Sittlichkeit. So ethical life is something that Hegel wished to realize by showing individuals how this could be achieved. And when he talked about modern society, the most comprehensive version of it, of course, is Elements of Philosophy of Right that he published in 1821. And there's a copy of this is the cover, the one I have. So he starts making very clear distinctions between the family, civil society, and the state. And so by 1821, these ideas that he's gone back and revisited and reformulated and reassessed really take their most final form. And in this book, civil society, as it was initially described by Ferguson, ends up being a stage between two things, right? It's a stage between the kind of micro community of the family. Now, think back, prior to this, there was really no discussion about the role of the family. For almost 1,500 years, the family almost didn't exist. And even in Ferguson's work, he's more concerned with civil society than he is perhaps with the family. Hegel is saying, no, there is that natural community within society that we need to address. So he placed that micro community of the family at the base of society. And in between was the regular society. In between was civil society. And all of that was surrounded by a kind of macro community of the state. So we have this kind of three-part structure, we'll say, of society, modern society, the family, and then civil society, which is the world of transactional behaviors and transactional relationships. This takes into account some of the social contract theories that we had talked about. Then, of course, what we talked about last week as well, the notions presented by Smith and Ferguson, trying to maintain Aristotelian virtues, a degree of morality in terms of making the right choices. And Hegel revisits a lot of these ideas, but takes it much further, much more comprehensive, much more structured, and of course, interrelational, right? There's a kind of dialectical relationship that occurs between the micro community of the family and then the macro community of the state. And so this kind of work, and it's here by 1821, when Hegel presents his very comprehensive view of civil society, basically economics, right? And all these transactional relationships that individuals have with one another, providing goods and services or purchasing goods and services. That's where Hegel begins to find a few enemies, because civil society is interpreted by the political left and the political right very, very differently. Because on the left, we have Karl Marx's economic and political theories that start with his critique, his being Marx's critique of Hegel's view of civil society. So we'll take a look at these ideas next week. But at this early point, Marx's beginnings can be found in the commentary that Hegel presents to us regarding civil society. So the kind of left-wing portion of Hegelians, because these were also known as the young Hegelians, because Marx and Feuerbach and others were individuals who were young, just coming out of school, if not still in school, all of them enamored by Hegel, but tangling with him in different ways. And this is what I mean when Hegel, no matter what position you take, you have to deal with him. So we have on the left Marx's beginnings of economic and political theory as criticisms towards civil society. But on the right, we have basically kind of a respect for Hegel's ideas regarding culture, society, politics. Everything is fine. This is a great system. And really, after Hegel passed away in 1831, the right wing group of Hegelians simply were just waiting for time to unfold so they can kind of plug in the holes here and there and really not advance Hegel's ideas very well. What's remarkable with Feuerbach and Marx, for example, Bruno Bauer is another one, these philosophers literally would not have existed without Hegel. So even by way of criticism, their work begins with that. It begins with an engagement with Hegel and his notion of civil society before they begin to develop their own ideas. So, what does Hegel actually do in his philosophy of right? And why did it become so problematic? So I'll give you kind of a descriptor of what the book is about, and then I'll give you just one example of where you could see someone like Marx, tearing his hair out, going like, why did you say this? Okay, so let's back up just for a moment. What philosophy of right talks about, and what it is really concerned with, is this notion of free will. If we have a free will, individuals have a free will, it means that we can enter into agreements with other individuals regarding property rights and relations, various contracts of different kinds, deeds and liens and so on. We can make moral commitments to one another based on trust and honesty and not lying. We can also have a kind of modicum of family life, because family life is, of course, at this early point, already being tested by the imperative nature of economics. Those economic imperatives to move to a different part of the city or a different part of the country where the work is, of course, would really antagonize relationships within the family. But also the world of economics, the legal system, all of those are now going to be testing the degree to which individuals have free will. So for Hegel, it is very clear, and he says, a person is not truly free unless he or she becomes a mutually recognized individual through his or her participation in all of the different realms of the social and political life of the state. So, to be free, you have to be not only self-conscious of who you are and be conscious that you have free will, but you have to have that will recognized by others. Your freedom expressed through your free will needs to be recognized by another person. It isn't just, I think, therefore I am, and the world looks just like me. No, it's not. Hegel says, no, that part, I'm sorry, but Descartes got wrong. We need to mutually recognize one another in order for our free will to be expressed, but another's free will to be expressed. And through that, we can enter into contracts, relationships, whether they lead to a family, whether they lead to friendship, a stronger community bond, all those things that Ferguson thought were important, almost these kind of Aristotelian virtues, all of those were good. But Hegel said, regardless, you have to be mutually recognized by another person and your free will be recognized. Otherwise, it's only abstract. It's not substantial. And substantial is one of these strange philosophical words that means expressed in real life. So your free will needs to be expressed in the social world that you live in, and more importantly, be recognized by others. So whatever the realm of the social, cultural, economic, or political life of the state that you're in, it needs to be recognized. And so with this really fundamental idea, Hegel tries to define and explain this notion of mutual recognition. And he does it by looking at, and you'll notice it's always in threes. And this is perhaps biblical, the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost, a triadic relationship. You'll see this all the time. And in the book, in Philosophy of Right, it's no different. But certainly all of these ideas should sound familiar because we've talked about them in various ways, and maybe not to the degree of comprehensiveness as Hegel. But certainly abstract right were things that the ancient Athenians believed they had, but only in an abstract way, did not realize that freedom needs to be expressed. We can't talk about it as an ideal. It needs to be substantiated. So the first sphere, the first part of the book, talks about abstract right, or at least the abstract idea of respecting others' rights. So here we have abstract right. I have a free will. I have rights. Remember those natural rights that we talked about with Locke, pursuit of freedom and happiness and liberty and equality. Those are abstract rights. They're just abstract principles. So Hegel says, yes, absolutely. These are the abstract rights that we know exist, that we know we believe in, that define who we are as individuals, but that's not enough. So the second sphere, he goes into morality. And here, individuals reflect upon the subjectivity or the existence of others in an effort to respect them and their own free will. So it is here in the second section that Hegel takes this abstract idea of right, of life, liberty, and the rest of it, and says, okay, it needs to exist in a social world. It needs to exist in a dimension that is real and in a dimension that is social. Individuals live with one another. We cannot live outside society. We live within a society, and those abstract rights need to be respected. And the way in which we do it is by considering morality. And again, this should sound familiar. These are the very same ideas that Smith and Ferguson were discussing from last week, and the hope was that we would be able to maintain these kinds of moral choices. So we have on the one hand abstract right, on the other hand moral choices that we can make that will respect a person's free will, that will respect that other person's abstract rights. So now we're talking about interrelationships, whether it's family, civil society, and of course he's leading up to it and transitioning in the second sphere into the third, which is ethical life. So this is the totality of these moral choices that we make based on our notions of abstract right. So mutual recognition, the recognizing or the recognition that we have these abstract rights, the respect of those rights and our free will, and then all of this in a kind of universal understanding that the legal notion of right, and again, remember last week and the week before, that the legal system, the institutions that are part of the state, must reflect our abstract rights. Otherwise, they will be disconnected from our hopes and dreams and our desires, but also our rights. So ethical life is this kind of universal view of all of the legal and political and social structures that surround us and also protect us, but mostly should reflect back to us those abstract rights. So there's a kind of folding in upon itself from going to an abstract, unsubstantiated right to the moral choices that present those rights to others and are respected, to then the larger scheme of those same abstract rights that are now supported and also recognized by institutions. And that's essentially how the book is structured. But at the foundation of it is this notion of rights and free will that we should always have and should never be thwarted or stymied or deferred in some way. And this is really where this notion of civil society becomes so important for Hegel. He wants to unpack this idea of abstract right, and make sure that it works on every level, whether it's economic, social, political, or cultural. So the account that he presents in 1821, which again is the most comprehensive one, tries to explain an individual's moral values and expectations, right, in relation to that historical development, right, the historical evolution of society itself. That's Adam Ferguson, right? That's where he got that from. And as a result, because Ferguson was writing in the 1770s, Hegel is writing literally 50 years later. In the 1820s, it's a very different world by this point. For 50 years now, industrialization's been happening, modernization of, technical innovation, science. All these things have changed. But at the core, what is not changing, because you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, is individuals' moral values and expectations. We enter into agreements with others with the expectation that we will be mutually recognized, or at least we will be recognized, mutually is both, but we will be recognized by others as having abstract rights that need to be expressed in a society in a substantial way. And so this becomes the new definition of social identity. It isn't that, hey, I'm good with the fact that only some people are free and some people are happy. No, everyone should be not only happy, but everyone should be free, and free to express that free will that is part of the abstract rights that we are born with as natural rights. And so all of this gives us a brand new outlook on modern society, brand new outlook on relationships between individuals. Now, in earlier political writings, Hegel talked about state bureaucracy as being somewhat self-interested, more worried with property, or more concerned with property than with individual rights. And whatever problems the state had, or the institutions that represent the state, Hegel believed that you could still transcend these issues and overcome them. And of course, one of the main complaints against Hegel was that he worked all these things out theoretically. So there was no actual change, physical change in reality. Hegel just worked out these problems theoretically because he was an idealist. So he dealt with ideas about the machine-like state, ideas about state bureaucracy, and worked out these dilemmas in his head, but never offered a solution as to, well, here's what it should look like in real life. He said, that's not my job. I'm just going to point the way forward. Okay, so one of the things that was really different, and now we've been stressing this now for the last few weeks, is how different modern economic society was during the time of Hegel to the ancient city-state defined by Plato and by Aristotle. And really what is happening is that the degree of consciousness, the growth of consciousness of the individual is really very, very different, which leads to these different economic structures. Because at the time of Aristotle's writing, we have the economikos, right? The oikos, which is the family. So in other words, the family and economics are tied together intimately because the family was often the site of where money was made and people were kept alive. But as time goes on and history develops and reason develops along with it, that distinction or lack of distinction is made much clearer. And eventually the family is a single entity, a single sphere. Civil society and economics is another sphere of its own, and then the state is still there. The state doesn't change so much. It is filled with lots of rules and regulations, and bureaucracy, which is basically an outgrowth of the guilds from the 1500s. But this sounds more like a poli-sci class. Let's stick to what we need to know here. This vastly different understanding of consciousness in the ancient world rather than in the modern world. So the development of individual consciousness is just literally not evident in the city-state. When we think of an individual, they are so deeply tied to either the family or to the state that they aren't fully developed individual consciousnesses, which is a hard one to say. You're thinking more in terms of groups. One of the groups being the family, another group being your fellow citizens. So individuality, right? Individual consciousness doesn't yet exist at this point. So at the very most, we have the beginnings of what is called a bourgeois consciousness. This would be the beginnings of the middle class. And it still takes time for people to fully develop as individuals, having not only consciousness, but more importantly, self-consciousness. This is something that is truly important. Okay, I mentioned it a moment ago that Hegel was very deeply influenced by Ferguson and by Smith. And so Enlightenment thought that's the Scottish version does seep into Hegel's work in the form of utilitarian social engineering, anything that helps to improve the overall happiness of a state rather than the individual is always going to be followed through. But also at the same time, that drive for absolute freedom, or as close to freedom or absolute freedom as possible. So we have on the one hand a movement towards the betterment of society, and on the other, a drive towards the betterment of individuals. So these two should go hand in hand. But utilitarianism doesn't always work this way. Utilitarians are typically more concerned with society than they are with the individual. So it does really take time for individuals to realize, okay, our society is very good, but I'm not participating in it. I'm not getting the benefits of a healthy society, a wealthy society. I don't get the affluence, right? I'm being left out. So Hegel said, no, the moment that begins, you're going to start feeling a degree of alienation, right? A kind of disconnection. So whatever utilitarian thinking that was on at the time, it needed to always be harnessed, or at the very least, be made aware of that drive towards absolute freedom, so that individuals would be aware that, yes, society is moving forward, but your life is going to directly benefit from it. And this kind of thinking, where things kind of go a bit screwy and kind of go off the rails, this is something that even Hegel was able to anticipate some of Marx's concerns regarding increasing and alienating divisions of labor. This notion that if you leave it unchecked, the worker just becomes increasingly impoverished. Yes, society becomes wealthier and wealthier overall, but the worker is suffering. And as a result, the monotony of working in a factory gives no one any degree of absolute freedom. You're, in a sense, kind of stuck there. So Hegel in his writings presents us with a very interesting view of the system of wants and needs that he calls civil society. And civil society, again, is still that glue that holds together the family, the microcosm, and the macrocosm of the state. But it is where Hegel tries to show how modern society sort of often will abandon entire groups of individuals to poverty and destitution that Hegel is the most frustrating. And I'm going to show you what I mean here. Okay, so in section 243 of Philosophy of Right, Hegel talks about this association of wants and needs. And those are universal because individuals need things, they want things, and people who produce products or have services to provide, they too wish to be able to make money and accumulate some degree of wealth. So it's universal in the sense that wants and needs always continue to exist. Now, but on the other hand, here's where the problem is, where society becomes better and better, but leaves behind the worker. And he writes, the specialization and limitation of particular work also increase, along with the dependence of the class which is tied to such work. And this kind of a situation decreases the ability to feel and enjoy the wider freedoms available in civil society. And he writes, quote, when a mass of individuals sink below a certain standard of living, that feeling of right, integrity, and honor, which comes from supporting oneself by one's own activity and work, is lost. When you are suffering the daily grind of going to a factory to make a product, whether it's making pins or making chairs or eventually much later making cars, right? It doesn't matter where you're working. To be lost, to be lost and be a cog in a wheel, that's not freedom. That's most certainly not absolute freedom. It is a grind. And as you see society benefiting from your work, that alienation continues to evolve and become much worse. So that's what he means. When the mass of individuals, and this is, in this case, a working class, sinks below that standard, then yeah, your reason for working is lost. So he goes on and says, poverty in itself does not reduce people to a rabble. A rabble is created only by the disposition associated with poverty, by inward rebellion against the rich, against society, the government, etc. So in 1821, Hegel is already writing about the 1%, right? Enjoying all the benefits, all those utilitarian benefits or utilitarian derived benefits of a good society, a wealthy and affluent society. And yet the worker is stuck. And this is where Hegel becomes very frustrating, because he is critically aware of what he's talking about. He is aware of the horrors of industrial society, much like Ferguson and Smith were. But at the time when he should be presenting a solution, he goes quiet. And instead of searching for a solution that would at least deal with this social danger, he looks instead for a system that would integrate it and accommodate it. Now, he doesn't talk about unemployment insurance or Ontario Works. He doesn't talk about any kind of a system. He simply says that we need to integrate the fact that some people can suffer from poverty into a greater and more integrated system that will accommodate that and not reduce people to a rabble. And rabble is just like abject poverty. So abject poverty is created only by the disposition associated. So to be poor is not necessarily a bad thing, because now we're supposed to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and move forward. Well, what if you don't even have boots, let alone bootstraps? What if you are suffering from abject poverty, holding down 3 jobs just to barely make your rent? Hegel is silent. Hegel doesn't say anything. So Hegel was holding fast to his belief that philosophy could describe and interpret the world and not change it, right? It would take Marx to turn that formula on its head. And there are several passages in the 3rd section of Philosophy of Right that are quite similar. So it is very frustrating to read Hegel and know how intelligent he was and how comprehensive and how cute his eye was. And yet he remains silent on, he just interprets the world, doesn't change it, doesn't offer our abilities to change it. Okay, here I just want to talk briefly about freedom, because this is something that is of great concern for Hegel. Freiheit and frei, freedom and free. These are very important words because they deal directly with the freedom of the will, freedom in social and political senses, and of course, freedom contrasts with slavery and dependence and compulsion. And again, just like Geist tries to integrate all these different social, political, and cultural institutions into one great entity, Hegel himself tries to do the same thing with the history of philosophy. Once again, Hegel tries to interconnect all these different varieties of freedoms in the plural into a single theory. And so the single theory, the core of this idea, is that a person is free if and only if it is independent and self-determining. That is not determined by or dependent on someone else. So that is his definition of freedom, that a person is free if that person is independent and self-determining. You're not at the mercy of something else. So what I want to do here is kind of look at, it's in 3 parts, and this at times should almost sound like early forms of psychology and psychoanalysis, which is really what Hegel has given us. He's not only given us ideas to follow through in political economy, and also sociology and some anthropology, but he's now at this point far transcending Plato's early ideas about desires, that we should simply ignore them, and saying, no, we can't. We need to do something about them. Okay, so here is Hegel on freedom. The first thing he says is that the boundary between myself and others is not fixed or permanent, either in my life or throughout history, nor is my content fixed or permanent. What I am depends on my self-consciousness. So I am a person that is comprised of thoughts, perceptions, desires, a body, and all of these things are free insofar as these and my pursuit of them are not other determined. In other words, I'm not the slave to something else. I'm not the slave to another person, to another condition that I cannot control. So the problem is, because we are porous individuals, right? We're not these absolute entities like Descartes. I think, therefore I am, and therefore my mind can operate without a body. We're not. Hegel goes, no, we're not. We're social beings. We live in the world. So my thoughts, my perceptions, my desires, everything that indicates who I am. Now, probably in a few weeks, when we look at existentialism, you'll see how important this language is, because really that's something else that Hegel does, is present to us early ideas about existentialism. So he says, all of these entities, these constituent parts that make up who I am, these desires are determined from without, and sometimes not easily controlled by me. So rather than be like Plato and just ignore them, which Hegel thinks is impossible, we have to be aware of them. We have to acknowledge them, and then we have to try to figure out some way to deal with it. So our bodily desires, our sense perceptions sometimes can feel alien because we seem to not have control over them. We could be like Plato and try to ignore them, but that would be, again, having those feelings control us. So when Hegel talked about absolute freedom and he talked about, self-determined, it also meant our desires. And so freedom from the intrusions of nature can be attained by submitting to moral laws and imposed by reason. This is something that Kant also talked about, that a person is most free when they follow the law, right? When they follow the letter of the law. So there's no confusion. There's no choices to be made. You simply follow. You follow whatever needs to be asked of you in terms of duties or expectations. So this is where ultimate freedom is. But Hegel does say that those bodily desires can sometimes feel alien to ourselves, and we need to be able to channel and filter those desires through reason, through thought. And if we can reason out the fact that if we simply follow the letter of the law and follow our duties, then we are less likely to be to be caught up in these desires that otherwise would end up making our lives very, very difficult. So he's also not saying this is easy, because he says desires in the external world cannot be so easily ignored, which is something that Plato was arguing, because to repress those desires becomes a kind of enslavement. We try our best to ignore it, and sometimes these desires are manifested in other forms of behavior. Now we're getting into kind of Freudian psychology here. So this is Hegel talking in 1807, right? So a good almost 100 years before Freud even began writing on these things. So notions of desire to Hegel are very, very important, because those desires and how they're expressed in the external world need to be mediated in such a way that we still respect the abstract rights of others. Because remember, it is about this abstract right, and we also need to be aware that those desires could be alienating. These could be urges that we need to think about and somehow mediate through reason and thought. And as a result, the boundary between ourselves and the other will shift around, be very permeable, right? They're very porous. And so if we are able to become aware of the existence of these desires and a way to kind of sublimate them and still follow the letter of the law, we have a better chance of controlling those desires. For example, if you have a desire to pound someone out, you could become a boxer. That's socially useful. You can become a football player or a hockey player. That's socially useful, and they pay you lots of money. If you have this desire to kill, rather than going out and becoming a serial killer, you could join the army. And there's all these different ways in which Hegel says, regardless, and of course these are extreme, but for the most part, desires can be socially sublimated through forms of behaviors that are accepted and that are legal. And Hegel says if you can do that, you will have control over those desires that otherwise would make your life very difficult. So when we live in a society and we are overseen by a state, we know that that state represents a space where all these different forms of individual freedoms are most free. Now, the state has priority over individuals, and it has its own rights that stand above individuals' own determined rights and freedoms. That's utilitarianism again, right? The notion that the greater good is not for individuals, but in fact for the state itself. So it is the state that benefits from these particular choices that are made. So the state is priority over the individual, and therefore its rights stand above individuals' own determined rights and freedoms. Now, once there is a disconnect between the state and those individual freedoms, when there's a disconnect and things are kind of going off the rails, Hegel says yes, at its worst, perhaps a revolution is the way in which to fix that. But as much as possible, if the state develops in a form that is conducive and consonant with individuals, then that disconnect is less likely to happen. That alienation is less likely to happen. And if we can be mindful of what the state asks of us and still operate within the rights that we know we have. For Hegel, it's at that moment that the individual submits to the law and is the most free. I know it sounds like a paradox. Kant says the same thing. When we follow the letter of the law, we are free. We are the most free because we're not tortured by choice. We know what to do. These are our duties. These are our expectations. We know what to do. We're free in that sense. Now, along with the first one, that's my body is porous and my desires are other directed and so on. There's also the second one where Hegel talks about several types of other determinations, right? Our relationships to others. And over time, we become more reasonable. Historically, we've changed over a long period of time. And the paradigm that I've talked about a number of times, the notion of slavery in ancient Greece, right? That was the paradigm of social and political unfreedom. There were many people who were not free. They literally were slaves. And yet the people that were writing public policy or philosophy were free. So for them, that wasn't something to aspire to. They were already there. What they wanted to aspire to was simple happiness. And Hegel says, yeah, that's all fine and good, but you have to be aware that without freedom, there is no happiness. It's not possible. So historically, we have moved further and further along in our consciousness and our self-consciousness and our understanding and mutual recognition of others to get to the point where we know that slavery is literally at odds with the essence of human beings. If our natural rights are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and equality, slavery is literally the embodiment of unfreedom. So he writes in Philosophy of History, this is a collection of essays that came out after his death, 1837. He writes, the consciousness of freedom, right, the idea or the awareness of freedom, first arose among the Greeks. Therefore, they were free. But they and the Romans likewise knew only that some were free, that man as such is free. Even Plato and Aristotle did not know this. As intelligent as they were, they didn't realize that the idea of freedom was simply just that only certain people were free themselves. And then finally, the third one, the transition towards the necessity of being free, and in the true freedom occurs when the necessity with which one thing determines another becomes so intense that they cease to be distinct. They come together as one. And one of the ways in which Hegel does this, to show this as an example, is how desire, love and sexual desire, fuses together into the family. When two individuals come together and through that desire called love, which is a natural thing, that is maintained within the family. So what happens is the family ceases to be distinct as individuals, but becomes a social unit, the family. So freedom internalizes rather than replaces necessity. And as a result, right, freedom lies in the identity and deeper understanding of the other with oneself. So freedom becomes an interrelationship, right? Interrelationship between two individuals. And when that happens, Hegel says when it's pure and it's natural, it results in a family. And when that happens, this no longer is necessary. It simply just occurs. It internalizes it. You know that this is what you need to do. And again, compared to the Greek polis, the way that the families were looked at were vastly different. Again, part of the family included slaves and transient workers. The offspring of the couple would often work as well. So it was a more undifferentiated unity of the economic structure and the family structure, quite unlike what was happening in the modern world at the time Hegel is writing. He says, of course, the family continues to exist because it is a natural disposition between individuals who mutually respect one another, who love one another, and eventually that love is so powerful that it literally fuses together into a couple, and in a couple into a family. Now, the last thing regarding freedom is one of these really strange and interesting notions about freedom in terms of what he calls the cunning of reason. Now, this is something that many theorists past or beyond Hegel have said, well, how can you think of history as this progressive movement all the time? And Hegel at least presents this. The cunning of reason, as he describes it in Philosophy of History, is this idea, this notion that the history of the world presents us with a rational process, that we somehow can see throughout the movement of history this coming to be, right, of reason. If we, in our history of consciousness and our history of philosophy, if we can see greater and greater amounts of reason and rationality and greater amounts of freedom and happiness, this is, for Hegel, the cunning of reason. And reason is almost like an entity, a thing that exists on its own, and it uses us to express itself. That's kind of what makes it a little bit trippy, but that's the way essentially that Hegel is describing it. It starts in nature, it moves out into people and is lost, and finds itself again through humanity, through human interaction, and all of the institutions, scientific, cultural, artistic, it finds itself re-expressed and brought together again. So it's together, it moves out into the world and it's estranged and alienated from itself, finds itself and comes back again as that final absolute spirit. Again, yes, it's trippy, but that's the way Hegel sees freedom. And he sees that as the constant coming to be of reason. And that is the fullest, right, the fullest manifestation, fullest version of spirit. So he writes, I am free, on the contrary, when my existence depends upon myself. The self-contained existence of spirit is none other than self-consciousness, consciousness of one's own being. So I am self-conscious of who I am. I see the world reflected back to me. I am at home in the world, and I see around me all the institutions that reflect back to me the fact that spirit is alive and well, and it's constantly coming into being. It is constantly coming to better and better versions of itself. Now, Hegel also thought that once we hit liberal democracy in the 1830s, that was it. Didn't get any better than that. But again, he warned us, remember, I'm a product of my time, so that's the way I saw the world. So clearly there were some problems with his form of thinking, because if that's the case, if the coming into being of reason is a good thing, then how do you account for not one but two world wars, like massive carnage at his doorstep? It's one thing that Napoleonic Wars, right, which is one country to another, but two world wars and the number of dead is just beyond comprehension. So to make an argument that history is the cunning of reason, well, reason was asleep at the wheel during most of the 20th century and is perhaps either dead and gone or slowly waking up. We don't know. But life right now is very difficult, and the cunning of reason is trying to find some way to express itself, right? Stay tuned. Okay, alienation, second last part I want to look at here, and I've already been going for almost an hour. That is another very important idea that Hegel believed was very much a modern condition. And Marx did talk about Hegelian philosophy and did talk about some of the ideas that are presented in terms of alienation. But what happens here is, for Hegel, modernity is itself the outgrowth of the breakdown of that ancient polis, right? And the idea behind integrating social life is a way to overcome alienation. So we have the ancient polis, which is this sort of organic unity. It breaks apart, and individuals live under various conditions, historical conditions that are not very, very good, very not conducive to overcoming alienation. We have what he called the unhappy consciousness, and this goes on for years and years, for centuries. And it takes until the cusp of modernity for us to rediscover the fact that we should be integrated together. And this is why freedom and abstract right and mutual recognition and all these things are so important, because that awareness and that recognition of these things allows us to reintegrate ourselves into social life. So the idea of alienation starts for Hegel as early as 1801. And he saw that the breakdown between society and philosophy, or society and thinking, is something that was really worth looking at. So he writes that when the might of union vanishes, remember, he's all about integration. When the might of union vanishes from the life of men, of course, he says men because that's really the only people that are doing these transactional contracts with one another. When that union vanishes from the life of men and the antitheses lose their living connection and reciprocity and gain independence, the need of philosophy arises. So in other words, when unity and integration disappear from social life, we end up with this fragmented sense of modernity, and fragmented through alienation, through alienated labor, alienated relationships with one another. What if relationships become purely transactional? What if every relationship you have with someone is all about them trying to get something from you? Those are not deep and abiding relationships that integrate you to another person and lead to, deep connections between the two of you. No, everyone's always looking out for someone else, or looking out for someone else to give them something. So when that unity disappears, then alienation begins. So for Hegel, alienation is that state of disconnection, right? That emerges from that very simple unity. Now it could be a unity that you find initially in the family, and then you leave that family to go out and go to school and go to work, and you want to bring it back somehow. You want to sort of reconnect. So some people make sure to reconnect with their family and friends. They may sometimes move back to where they used to live, but they make an attempt to reconnect into some kind of higher unity. And for Hegel, alienation is just simply that disconnection from whatever that simple unity may have been. And he writes about it a number of different times and comes up with a number of different conclusions. So there's a fragment called Love, a very early piece, 1798 or something like that. And he talks about how love can be one of the ways in which you can overcome alienation. And this is, of course, the one that drives two individuals to come together, to fuse as one into a family. So he writes in the fragment on love that human life undergoes this process of kind of immature unity, opposition, and then finally a reunion. So love restores unity. Right? It brings people together. It restores unity of individuals and individuals with each other. And so it brings together individuals, those people with the world, but without annihilating, right? Without destroying the individual in its place. So he writes, true love, or love proper, exists only between living beings who are alike in power, and thus in one another's eyes, living beings from every point of view. In no respect is either dead for the other. This genuine love excludes all opposition. Union feels independence as a hindrance. Love is indignant if part of the individual is severed and held back as a private property. So people give all of themselves, their totality, to that other person, and each does that with the other. There's a true, genuine integration of those two personalities. And he says a true union, or true love proper, actually strengthens both those people. So both those individuals, in lucky enough in this union of pure love or genuine love, all those other oppositions are gone and you feel one and the same. Now, one of the issues with this kind of thinking, though, is when Hegel writes about the family, he immediately fuses the male and female, which is the traditional bourgeois family, fuses male and female into simply male. So in terms of feminist thinking, he was completely backwards. Unfortunately, what is good here is this notion of love proper, fusing two individuals together. The problem is that once those two individuals come together, only the man is recognized. And again, Hegel is a product of his time. Now, the next piece, fragment of a system, here instead of love, it's religion. Religion enables individuals to transcend this sort of finite or individual restricted life and become part of something greater, right? Something greater that is infinite life which has happened in the past, will continue in the future, and this notion of Geist, right, or spirit, that glues the whole world together. And so Hegel here is using religion to try to deal with a number of different problems, right? The eternal and the temporal, God and humanity, subject and object, all these different opposites that even reflective thinking, right? So this is idealist thinking. Opposites of reflective thinking is unable to bring together and unite. So the key, right? The key here is the notion of religion and notions of God, where infinite life, right, is united with the individual who shares in that infinite life. So to be part of a theological disposition, to be part of a religious belief, to believe in God, and to think that so many other people have believed in God for thousands of years, right? I'm part of that group. That's what he means by the fact that religion can overcome some of these feelings of alienation. By 1801, it was philosophy. So this is within a very short period of time, but with 1798 to 1801, so over about 3 years, it's love, then it's religion, and then finally he settles on philosophy as reason. So philosophy, rather than love or religion, is able to reconcile the alienation that is involved in the development of modernity or the human culture in general, and the task of philosophy. Because remember, as he says, the task of philosophy is to unite these people. So the task here is to unify all of these givens and overcome alienation. And this is the way in which this single consciousness that we are part of something greater, whether it's the family or civil society or the state or ultimately ethical life. So within a very short time, Hegel proposes 3 different versions or 3 different solutions and finally settles on philosophy, right? Philosophy as reason for us to understand our position in the world using thought, using consciousness, and especially self-consciousness. We can see ourselves reflected back in the institutions of society, and in so doing, able to overcome this feeling of alienation. Okay, so the last thing here is just ask about Hegel today, because remember, he warned us that he was a child of his time. He did the best he could. He was not a radical. He was not highly critical. He just pointed things out. So Hegel today is looked at in a number of different ways. At the very least, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have to tangle with him no matter what. If you are doing continental philosophy, if you ignore Hegel, it's at your peril. Don't do it. Okay, in 1948, for example, after the Second World War, in Sense and Nonsense, Maurice Merleau-Ponty argued that just about every 19th century philosophy, Marx, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, all these folks we're going to look at, as well as 20th century theories about phenomenology, existentialism, psychoanalysis even, all of it can be traced back to Hegel and to Hegel's very speculative form of philosophy, to speculate, to look at, right, to look into and to comprehensively integrate all together under this, this category of spirit. So it was Hegel, according to Merleau-Ponty, quote, who started the attempt to explore even the irrational and integrate that into an expanded form of reason. And what he meant by that was even the unhappy consciousness that may do crazy things because they are alienated, they're sad, they're frustrated and confused. Those are forms of irrationality. At no point did any philosopher prior to this ever talk about forms of mental illness and where they may come from. Forms of mental illness that are derived from alienation. That's what makes Hegel so remarkable. As well, Hegel's very speculative philosophy has this sort of odd, sort of a Janus-like quality. Janus is the god that could look forward and backwards from ancient Greece. So Hegel's ideas, his philosophy looks back to Aristotle's metaphysics, Platonic forms, to the ancient polis, and yet at the same time fully aware that the social and political changes that are brought upon by the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, are equally important. So we cannot keep our heads in the sand and only think about Plato. We need to be fully aware of the world that we live in. Now, he didn't want to deny the history of consciousness. What he wanted to do was to bring together all those different strands that we've talked about, whether they're cultural, social, political, economic, the family. And he wanted to bring all these differences to the threshold of this world that he was living in, that even it took until 1840 for Germany to become industrialized to the same degree as France and England. So he already knew it was only a matter of time, but he wanted to integrate all of these inquiries together and bring them to the threshold of this brand new world. The other issue too is the cunning of reason, another fascinating idea. And here, reason is both cunning and forever trying to move forward. It's restless. And this famous line, section 32 of the Phenomenology, where he talks about spirit is this power only by looking the negative in the face and tearing with it. So spirit, which is our drive, our free will, our greater and greater degrees of freedom, all of that is the power of looking a problem in the face, the negative in the face, and struggling with it. So for Hegel, it's not an easy ride, nor is it a free ride. But all that hard work, all that tearing, and all that struggle, the struggle to overcome all these obstacles will renew us as fully rounded, conscious, and free human beings. So it's a world that is not simply given. It is a world that we have to struggle to achieve and maintain and make sure it doesn't go off the rails again, right? It's a world that itself results in its own movement, its own restlessness. That world is contested all the time. We're seeing this right now. The world is being contested by different forces, different political forces all the time. And we're at a point now where things are looking pretty dire depending on where you are on the political spectrum. But that's Hegel, right? Hegel said sometimes we're going to have some bad days, and absolutely these days are not good at all for all kinds of people. But somehow our awareness that there is a problem, that's reason at work. Reason is getting us to think about, okay, how are we going to get out of this? We cannot do it without consciousness and reason. So that's why he says it's both cunning and forever restless, because it is always looking for that negative and ready to struggle with it. Now, Hegel, depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, you can say that he's an economic liberal because he is someone that promotes capitalist society. But we need to control those extremes, right? And here he's very much like the Scottish Enlightenment. Both Smith and Ferguson warned us of these extremes of wealth and poverty, that we cannot have a political system that favors businesses and industry, because eventually there will be that disconnect between state institutions and individuals who are its subjects. He's also a cultural conservative. He says that some social individuals should be held accountable to reasonable standards of personal responsibility. So we can't be revolutionaries at a moment's notice. We need to reach a certain point where maybe that will be an inevitable choice. And when it becomes inevitable and necessary, there's reason at work as well. So Hegel's sort of philosophical narrative, which is rich and complex and integrating virtually everything, these are ideas that are also teleological. This is a little bit like Aristotle, that Hegel looks at the world as kind of a teleological project, and we are going to see it play itself out. But do we ever know when the end is here? Because there have been arguments made that liberal democracy as it was in the 1980s and 1990s was it. It couldn't get any better. And right now, most of us really yearn for that simpler world. Over the last 20, 25 years, we've been through hell. And as a result, Hegel says, hold on, right? There will be bad days, but an awareness that things are bad is a first step towards using reason. So is there anything we can salvage and we can keep from Hegel? Yes, absolutely. And these four things are still important. There will always be the struggle for desire and for mutual recognition, because we still all have abstract rights. We all have free will. Second, the interaction between consciousness and self-consciousness, the degree to which we are self-conscious of our actions, of our behaviors, of our thoughts, of our interaction with others, absolutely crucial. The struggle to overcome indeterminacy. And this, again, these are going to look very familiar when we talk about existentialism, but all of these, the first three in particular, the third one, to overcome indeterminacy, to overcome the fact that others control your lives. Others are basically calling the shots as much as possible, again, being a social human being, to be able to determine your own life. This is something that Hegel believed was very important and one of the royal road, right, to freedom. So to overcome indeterminacy, the inability to even have a choice, let alone make a choice, that's not the position you want to be in. You need to put yourself in a position where you can make a choice and determine your fate. Nietzsche picks up on that. We'll see in a couple of weeks. And finally, the last one, the knowledge that the human subject is split between the ego, right, as a kind of psychical category, the ego, the brain, the mind, and also gender as a social category. So those two are very, very important. Now, Hegel doesn't talk very much about gender, but even by his lack of communication regarding the matter, he has given us ideas where we can, by critique, say, such as the one I gave you, well, wait a minute. Two people fused together. Well, why are they recognized two people as man? Why can't they be husband and wife or couple? Why is it that everything gets subsumed and reduced to one person? So the knowledge of the human subject is both an ego and a psychical category and a gender, which is a social category. Those two, that balance needs to be worked out even still today. So this is what makes Hegel so important. Yes, it took a long time, a lot of material to cover, but when we get to the Zoom meeting, if you have any questions, please, I studied and still continue to study Hegel. I know some of it is very rich and complex and sometimes overwhelming, but I think Hegel still has a lot of things to say to us. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see each other again next week when we carry on. Take care then.